Hey guys, tonight we're diving deep into a world where your stomach is an unreliable companion and the phrase medieval food likely makes you shudder, not from hunger, but from dread. Imagine trudging through a damp, smoky village where your next meal is uncertain and often barely edible, surrounded by smells that you probably won't survive. The clatter of wooden bowls and the faint, unpleasant tang of poorly stored grain fill the air as you brace yourself for another day of eating mostly the same bland mush. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where in the world you are as we explore these sleepy stories together. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You start your day in a medieval village centuries before supermarkets and microwaves, where your diet is dictated by the soil beneath your feet and the rigid social order above your head. Agriculture is the cornerstone of life, but don't picture neat rows of fresh vegetables or shiny apples. Instead, imagine heavy, gritty soil, small plots overworked year after year, and crops vulnerable to pests, bad weather, and simple exhaustion. Most of what you eat is what your village can grow, or gather barley, rye, oats, and some root vegetables. Wheat is rarer and reserved mostly for the higher classes. Historians still argue whether the quality of medieval crops was as poor as some records suggest, or if later famines and economic stress worsened things over time. Feudal society shapes what lands you can farm and what you owe your lord, which means your meals are as much about surviving obligations as nourishing yourself. As a peasant, your plate rarely changes a bowl of pottage, a thick stew made of boiled grains, vegetables, and sometimes scraps of meat or fish if fortune allows. This pottage is the humble hero of the medieval diet, but also its dull villain, lacking much variation or excitement. You trudge to the communal hearth, the smoky heart of your home, hoping the pottage isn't too bitter or watery. The smoky, sometimes acrid aroma hints at the primitive cooking techniques you rely on: open fires and iron pots over unpredictable flames. It's a far cry from the sizzling, fragrant dishes you might imagine. Oddly, despite the scarcity and monotony, medieval people sometimes overcompensated with extravagant displays. The nobility's feasts covered later in our journey reveal how social hierarchy dictated access to food, and the focus was often more on spectacle than taste. But here in your daily life, the story is one of grinding toil, limited ingredients, and food as fuel rather than pleasure. It's fascinating to note that even the simplest medieval diets were influenced by a growing network of trade routes. Spices from the East, which you've likely heard about, were already trickling into Europe, though far too expensive for you. This trade created myths around exotic flavors and preserved foods, but the reality for most people was far less glamorous. Your food's freshness was a constant challenge, and preservation methods were crude, leading to odd tastes and frequent spoilage. And while you might imagine medieval people happily gathering wild berries or mushrooms, foraging was risky and inconsistent. The forest was both a pantry and a place of danger, filled with poisonous plants and wild animals. Historians still argue whether peasants relied heavily on foraged foods or if these were merely occasional supplements. The very foundation of your medieval meals rests on a fragile combination of nature, social order, and evolving culinary practice, all of which conspire to make the food of this era so infamously bad. But it's not just about what was on your plate, it's also about what wasn't and what you couldn't have no matter how hungry you were. The next 2,000 words will take you further into this world, unfolding the origins of the medieval diet and how it shaped the lives of millions. But for now, settle in and remember, you probably won't survive the meal, but you can survive the story. You wake up before dawn, the chill of the stone and mud hut creeping into your bones. Outside, the village is stirring slowly, mist hanging low over the fields that you'll soon labor in. Breakfast, if you can call it, that is a humble affair, a small piece of coarse bread, possibly dipped into leftover pottage from yesterday. You chew with a weary acceptance, knowing that today's food will be just as sparse, if not more so. The life of a medieval peasant is ruled by scarcity, repetition, and a persistent gnawing hunger that no amount of stubborn hope can quite erase. Peasant plates were notorious for their simplicity, and often their disappointment. Your diet largely consists of what's cheap and readily available grains like rye, barley, and oats ground into rough flour, root vegetables like turnips and onions, and the occasional legume if you're lucky. Meat is a distant luxury. Your bread is heavy, dense, and frequently riddled with imperfections. It might look like a loaf to an outsider, but biting into it reveals a tough, dry crumb that quickly dries your mouth. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants intentionally preferred such bread for its long shelf life, or simply had no alternative. The ever-present pottage, a watery stew of grains and vegetables, often served as the centerpiece of your meals. The taste bland, sometimes slightly sour if the grains had started fermenting. You add what little herbs you have, usually wild ones plucked from the hedgerows, but the flavor remains modest. In fact, the monotony of pottage could be so disheartening that you start to suspect the village cook was trying to test your patience more than your palate. If you're fortunate enough to have a small piece of salted pork or fish, it's treated like a rare delicacy. Salt, a precious commodity itself, was used both to preserve and to flavor, but the heavy-handed salting often left the meat tough and overly salty, not exactly a gourmet experience. Remember that weird salty crunch. That's salt preservation for you, saving your dinner from rot at the cost of taste. Peasants often drank ale or small beer with their meals not to get drunk, but because water was frequently contaminated with bacteria or parasites. The fermentation process made these drinks safer, but the taste was earthy and sour, far from today's crisp lagers or ales. Even children sipped on weak ale, an accepted norm that modern palates might find unsettling. Historians still debate whether these beverages were consumed out of necessity or as a cultural preference. When vegetables did appear, they were rarely the star of the show. Peas, beans, and cabbage were the most common, but often cooked to a mushy, unappealing consistency. The idea of a fresh salad or lightly sautéed greens would have been alien. Sometimes vegetables were boiled repeatedly to stretch a meal further, leaching any residual flavor. Your tongue quickly learns to expect blandness. Oddly enough, the peasant staple foods sometimes offered a strange kind of nutritional balance, grains providing calories, vegetables adding fiber, and the occasional meat or fish giving protein. Yet the reality was often malnutrition masked beneath the daily routine of eating. You feel tired, weak, and chronically hungry, but this was simply how life was. And then there's the social stigma. Your humble plate contrasts sharply with the elaborate feasts of nobles, where roasted swans and exotic spices were more about status than sustenance. This divide is more than economic. It's cultural, shaping the very way you view food and yourself. The scarcity and simplicity of your meals reinforce your place in the hierarchy, a reminder that you belong to the lowest rungs of medieval society. You notice that, despite the roughness, there's a strong sense of tradition tied to your food. Recipes pass down orally, methods of cooking, born from necessity rather than experimentation, and a resilient acceptance of your diet's limitations. Yet, even here, hints of innovation creep in. Some villages trade or barter small quantities of spices or preserved goods, adding fleeting moments of flavor that briefly break the monotony. And here's a quirky tidbit for you. In some regions, peasants use crushed snail shells as a calcium supplement, sprinkling the powder into their pottage. It sounds odd now, but it was a clever if unpleasant way to make the most of available resources. Historians still argue whether such practices were widespread or isolated survival tactics. The peasant diet, while basic and repetitive, was the foundation upon which medieval society functioned. Without it, the higher classes would have had nothing to feast upon. But for you, the everyday struggle to find palatable, sustaining food defined much of your existence. The texture, the blandness, the scarcity, all elements that shaped not only your body, but your mindset. So, as you trudge through another day fueled by humble pottage and hard bread, take a moment to appreciate the resilience required to endure such a diet. It wasn't just about taste or the lack of it, it was about survival. You find yourself walking into a great hall filled with the clamor of nobles and their guests. The scene is dazzling, long wooden tables laden with platters piled high, colorful cloths draped across benches, and servants bustling around, serving food with an almost theatrical flair. But don't be fooled. Beneath this spectacle, the reality of medieval noble banquets is a curious mix of showmanship and food that often disappoints the palate. Medieval feasts were more about status and ceremony than satisfying hunger or showcasing refined flavors. The grandiosity of the event mattered far more than the quality of the food. Think of it as the 14th century version of a flashy Instagram post, all the visual drama and less of the deliciousness. Roasted birds were sometimes stuffed with live birds, a spectacle designed to elicit gasps and laughter. But the actual meat was often overcooked or dry. Presentation trumped taste every time. You notice that dishes often arrived in strange courses, with foods heavily spiced, sweet and savory, sometimes blended in odd ways. Thick sauces often made from vinegar, sugar, and exotic spices masked the natural flavors of the meat. The goal was to impress with complexity and extravagance rather than genuine flavor. This leads to a curious contradiction. Despite the abundance of ingredients, the food often tasted muddled or overwhelming. The centerpiece dishes were often so heavily salted or preserved that they felt tough and chewy. You might have expected succulent roasts, but instead, the food leaned toward being functional for display and storage. These lavish banquets were sometimes planned days or weeks in advance, requiring foods that could endure lengthy preparation and transport. Historians still argue whether these banquets ever truly satisfied the guests' appetites, or if they left many reaching for their ale and disappointment. The use of spices is particularly telling. Exotic imports like cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg were status symbols scattered liberally to show off wealth, rather than to enhance flavor subtly. Your noble host might sprinkle enough pepper to make your eyes water, but that was the point: to dazzle and overwhelm, not to create balance. The reality is that these spices were often adulterated or poor quality, further complicating the taste. Interestingly, you learn that some nobles had personal cooks who knew how to prepare meals more suited to refined tastes, but these recipes were guarded secrets often lost to time. The surviving cookbooks reveal bizarre combinations and instructions that modern chefs would find baffling. Medieval culinary knowledge was a strange mix of practical techniques, superstition, and showy pageantry. You also notice the heavy reliance on bread during these banquets. Slices of stale bread were sometimes used as edible plates called trenchers, soaked in sauces and eaten at the meal's end, or discarded for dogs. This practice sounds odd now, but was practical for the time and reflected a different relationship to food waste and consumption. It's a reminder that even the elite lived with constraints you might not expect. Another quirky tidbit at some banquet subtleties: elaborate symbolic food sculptures or performances entertained guests between courses. These included sugar sculptures of castles' animals or mythical creatures, combining art and food in a way that had little to do with actual eating pleasure. You'd be forgiven for thinking these were just medieval party tricks, but they carried messages about power and divine right, a theatrical backdrop to the feast. Despite the pomp, foodborne illness was rampant at these gatherings, partly because the emphasis on display often trumped hygiene and proper cooking. Meat was sometimes served undercooked or left out too long, and the heavy drinking further complicated matters. You might chuckle, but historians still debate how much medieval nobility truly enjoyed their banquets versus enduring them as social obligations. In short, noble medieval feasts were a blend of ostentation, tradition, and culinary confusion. The food itself rarely rose above mediocrity, but the performance of eating together was essential in reinforcing social bonds and status. If you thought your family dinners were awkward, imagine sitting through one where the main entertainment was watching a stuffed swan flap its wings before being carved. So, as you lean back after this theatrical feast, remember, the medieval noble table was less about flavor and more about flaunting power. The food was often a side character in a grand, noisy play, one that set the stage for centuries of complicated eating habits to come. You're surrounded by piles of precious spices, their pungent aromas drifting through the dimly lit merchant's shop in a bustling medieval town. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and pepper, the rarest and most coveted treasures from distant lands. They were status symbols for the wealthy and mystical cure-alls whispered about by apothecaries. But, despite the reverence medieval society placed on spices, their actual impact on flavor is far less glamorous than you might expect. Spices were absurdly expensive due to long, perilous trade routes that stretched thousands of miles from Asia and the Middle East. Caravans braved deserts, mountains, and pirates to deliver these tiny packets of power. Because of this, their presence on the table was often more about showing off your wealth than truly enhancing the taste of food. It's like sprinkling gold dust on a mediocre dish, not very edible but impressive to guests. The obsession with spices is sometimes misunderstood. Medieval cooks tended to heap spices, generously masking the flavors of preserved or low-quality ingredients. Thick sweet and sour sauces drenched in exotic powders often overwhelmed the natural taste of the meat or vegetables beneath. Historians still argue whether this was a genuine culinary preference or simply a desperate attempt to disguise stale food. Adding to the spice mythos, many believed that these aromatic substances had medicinal properties, warding off illness or even moral corruption. Some even thought pepper could warm the body or drive away evil spirits, giving spices a magical aura beyond mere seasoning. However, the reality is a little less enchanting. The actual flavor profiles of many spices were not well understood, and the combination of pungent sweet and sour often resulted in clashing tastes rather than harmony. Early medieval recipes reveal mixtures of spices that today would seem bizarre. Imagine mixing cinnamon with fish sauce, or adding sugar to roast meat in ways that confuse more than delight your palate. A quirky tidbit, the black peppercorn was sometimes referred to as black gold and used as a form of currency or dowry payment. This underlines just how prized it was, far beyond its culinary worth. Imagine bargaining over pepper instead of coins. That's a spicy negotiation. Interestingly, the medieval European palate was still evolving. The abundance of spices led to a flavor overload that some modern chefs describe as medieval confusion, a kitchen where too much of everything often meant the true taste was lost in the chaos. This is why many people today find medieval food descriptions hard to believe. They simply don't sound delicious. So, while the spice trade sparked curiosity and brought exotic elements into European kitchens, the reality was far from the aromatic paradise the wealthy imagined. Spices were more about power, prestige, and occasionally desperation. You might wonder if medieval cooks ever paused to wonder if less could be more. Historians still debate whether simpler seasoning traditions existed alongside these extravagant spice displays, or if the heavy use of spices was nearly universal among the upper classes. As you breathe in the heady, overpowering scent of cloves and cinnamon, you realize medieval spice culture was as much about image as it was about taste, leaving us with a legacy that's both fascinating and, frankly, a little messy for the palate. You step into the dim, smoky kitchen of a medieval home or castle, where the lingering scent of burning wood mingles with the sharp tang of cured meats hanging from wooden beams. Food preservation is the silent, unsung hero or villain of medieval diets. Without refrigerators or modern containers, medieval cooks struggled to keep their ingredients edible, often resorting to methods that left a lasting impression on flavor, texture, and sometimes sanity. Preserving food wasn't just a convenience, it was a necessity. Fresh meat and dairy were highly perishable, and seasonal harvests meant storing food for leaner months was vital. Salt, curing, smoking, drying, and pickling were the mainstays of medieval preservation, but each came with quirks and costs that affected how food tasted, and not always in good ways. Salt curing was the most common method. You can imagine piles of meat rubbed and packed in salt, left to sit for weeks or even months. This process slowed bacterial growth, but left the meat incredibly salty and tough. Chewing on salted pork was like gnawing on a leather belt seasoned with ocean brine. The salt that saved your dinner from spoiling often made it nearly inedible. Remember that crunchy salt overload from peasant meals. It wasn't just a flavor choice, but a preservation survival tactic. Smoking, used primarily for fish and meats, added a distinctive flavor, but also introduced bitter charred notes. Kitchens were filled with dense smoke that clung to the walls and furniture, making your clothes and hair smell like a campfire for days. The smoke helped keep flies away and extended shelf life, but the taste was far from delicate. It's no wonder that medieval food often carried that heavy, smoky punch that modern tongues find challenging. Drying foods, especially fruits, herbs, and meats, was another popular method. Sun-dried fruits provided sweetness, but often turned leathery and tough. Dried meats like jerky were practical for travel, but hardly a gourmet delight. Your medieval fruitcake was probably dense and hard as a rock, though at least it lasted through long winters. Pickling, particularly with vinegar or fermented brines, added a tangy dimension to some preserved foods. However, vinegar was expensive, so pickled items were often limited to wealthier households. Fermented vegetables, while nutritious, might come with strong odors and sourness that challenged the palate. Here's a curious bit. Medieval cooks sometimes used honey as a preservative coating fruits or even small pastries to keep moisture out. Honey's natural antibacterial properties made it surprisingly effective, though the sticky sweetness wasn't always to everyone's liking. The preservation techniques often clashed with the limited cooking technologies. Over open fires, it was tricky to balance heat, leading to uneven cooking that didn't always soften tough preserved foods enough. Sometimes meals arrived burnt on the outside and raw in the middle, or the flavors just didn't meld well. Historians still argue how much the taste of preserved foods shaped medieval diets overall. Some suggest that the abundance of preserved items helped maintain a year-round food supply, albeit with compromised flavor. Others believe fresh food remained the preference whenever possible, and preservation was a last resort. In any case, the persistent presence of heavily salted, smoky, or sour preserved foods contributed greatly to the infamous reputation of medieval cuisine. The trade-off between longevity and taste was a delicate, often frustrating balance. So next time you reach for a snack, spare a thought for the medieval cook, whose salted pork or smoked fish could have been the difference between hunger and sickness, but certainly not a memorable meal. You're standing beside a murky village, well-watered, dark, and questionable looking, and you hesitate before dipping your cup. Medieval water was a notorious culprit behind countless illnesses, often murky, contaminated, and crawling with unseen dangers. So, people turned instead to ale, beer, and wine, not just for pleasure, but because these drinks were safer to consume than what came out of the tap. The problem with medieval water was that it was often drawn from shallow wells or stagnant ponds near latrines, livestock pens, or waste piles. Bacteria and parasites thrived, leading to outbreaks of dysentery, cholera, and other gut-wrenching diseases. Drinking water straight from these sources was a gamble few medieval people wanted to take. Historians still argue whether urban sanitation efforts ever effectively improved water safety before the modern era. This meant that from infancy you were likely introduced to ale or weak beer, known as small beer, which had low alcohol content but was boiled during brewing, killing off harmful pathogens. Even children drank it, as unpleasant as that may sound today. The brewing process made these beverages safer than water, and their mild bitterness helped mask unpleasant flavors. Wine was another popular choice, especially in Southern Europe, but its availability varied greatly by region and season. The wine you drank was often sour or thin, not the refined vintages we imagine today. Yet it was still preferable to water, and social rituals often revolved around communal drinking. Interestingly, ale and beer weren't just drinks. They were also vital sources of calories and nutrients, especially during times when food was scarce. The thick, yeasty brews sometimes served as a liquid meal, providing some sustenance alongside solid foods. You could say they were the medieval equivalent of a smoothie, just much earthier. On the flip side, the widespread consumption of alcohol, even in low doses, contributed to other health problems. Habitual drinking was the norm, and drunkenness was not uncommon at all levels of society. But, as much as we might cringe at the idea of giving toddlers ale, it was a practical survival strategy in a time of unsafe water. You might be amused to learn that some medieval recipes for ale included herbs like heather yarrow, or even bog myrtle, giving the drink odd, earthy flavors. The brewing process was as much a craft as an art, with each village or household putting its own twist on the brew. Yet the taste was far from the crisp, hoppy beers modern drinkers enjoy. Wine, when consumed, was often diluted with water and heavily spiced with cinnamon, cloves, or pepper. This mulled concoction was less about flavor and more about warmth and medicinal effect, especially during cold winters. It's a far cry from your typical chilled glass on a summer day. You also notice that in some regions people drank posca, a sour vinegar-based drink, favored by soldiers and lower classes. It was considered refreshing, but by all accounts quite pungent. This adds a quirky note to medieval beverage culture, highlighting the diversity born out of necessity. Despite all these oddities, the choice of drink was crucial in medieval life, shaping daily routines and social interactions. The preference for ale and wine over water wasn't just about taste or habit. It was a practical decision rooted in survival. So next time you sip a clean glass of water, take a moment to appreciate the safety and simplicity it represents, because medieval people definitely didn't have that luxury. They navigated a world where every drink was a risk, and every sip could bring both relief and peril. You sit down at a rough-hewn wooden table, a thick, uneven slab scarred by years of use, and before you rests the medieval staple bread. It's the foundation of nearly every meal, the glue, holding together the sparse elements of your diet. But don't expect fluffy, aromatic loaves. Medieval bread was a tough, dense, and often disappointing affair. Bread was so central that it came with its own social hierarchy. The finest, whitest bread, made from finely milled wheat flour, was reserved for the nobility called manchet, while peasants typically ate darker, coarser loaves made from rye or barley. This black bread was dense and heavy, often riddled with bits of bran and other impurities. Historians still argue how much this impacted nutrition, but the consensus is that the coarse grains gave peasants more fiber, yet less digestible energy. You bite into a slice, and your jaw works harder than expected. The crumb is chewy, and the crust is thick and sometimes burnt. Moisture is minimal, making it easy for the bread to stale quickly. Without modern packaging, bread had to be consumed fast, or risk becoming rock hard, often used later as a kind of edible plate or trencher. Trenchers were a medieval innovation, a slice of stale bread that doubled as a plate and was soaked in sauces or juices from meat dishes. Sometimes these were eaten afterward, but often they were discarded or fed to dogs. This practice might sound wasteful now, but reflected the medieval understanding of food use and hygiene. You might find it surprising that bread was more than just filler. It carried symbolic weight in religion and social life. Bread was associated with sustenance and divine blessing. It played a role in religious rituals and daily meals alike, marking its importance beyond mere nutrition. Interestingly, medieval bakers had to contend with unpredictable fermentation due to the natural yeasts available, resulting in inconsistent bread quality. Some loaves would rise nicely, while others remained dense and heavy. This made bread baking as much an art as a science or a gamble. Another quirky tidbit is the existence of horse bread, a term for the lowest quality bread, often made with bran-dried peas, or even acorns usually fed to animals or poor laborers. Eating this was a last resort, but when famine struck it, sometimes became the only option. Bread was also a tool for social control. Lords sometimes regulated bread prices and quality to maintain order and prevent unrest. Poor quality bread or sudden shortages could spark riots, so bread was more than food. It was a symbol of stability or desperation. Despite its flaws, bread provided crucial calories and was relatively easy to store and transport. It was the staff of life, supporting everything else in your diet. But the constant presence of hard, sometimes tasteless bread contributed heavily to the overall reputation of medieval food as bland and unsatisfying. You might imagine medieval people craving soft, fresh bread like we do today, but their expectations were shaped by what was available and affordable. For them, bread was sustenance, first comfort, second if at all. So as you chew through this tough, heavy loaf in your mind, remember that bread wasn't just something you ate, it was a reflection of medieval life itself, hard, basic, and essential. You wander through a humble garden patch on the edge of the village, where a patchwork of vegetables struggles against patchy soil and unpredictable weather. Vegetables were everywhere, yet strangely they were often overlooked or undervalued, especially by the nobility. For peasants, they were the backbone of the diet. For nobles, they were mere garnish, a sad afterthought to the main meat course. Common vegetables included onions, leeks, cabbage, turnips, and beans. Root vegetables like parsnips and carrots appeared occasionally, but were often dull in flavor and texture. The medieval palate was accustomed to boiled or stewed vegetables that lost much of their crunch and color, turning into mushy, bland lumps. This was partly due to the cooking methods, long boiling over open fires without the benefit of temperature control. Herbs like parsley, sage, and rosemary were sprinkled in when available, but fresh herbs were not as abundant as you might imagine. Spices overshadowed these local flavors in noble kitchens, while peasants made do with whatever grew wild or in their small gardens. Historians still argue whether the medieval elite ever truly appreciated fresh vegetables, or if their preference leaned toward richer, meat-heavy dishes. You can almost taste the boiled cabbage, that slightly sulfurous, limp vegetable that filled pots across the land. Despite its humble status, cabbage was a valuable source of vitamins and was often fermented to make sauerkraut, helping prevent scurvy during long winters. Fermentation, however, brought with it strong odors and sour flavors that modern palates might find challenging. Interestingly, legumes like peas and beans provided essential protein for peasants who rarely ate meat. These were dried and stored, then boiled into thick stews. Their earthy taste was sometimes enhanced with scraps of meat or herbs, but often the flavor remained plain and repetitive. Vegetables also had cultural and symbolic meanings. Some, like onions and garlic, were believed to ward off evil spirits or illness. This blending of food and folklore influenced how vegetables were grown, prepared, and consumed. The noble disdain for vegetables is a curious quirk. They were often seen as food for the poor or animals. You might be amused to learn that in some courts vegetables were hidden or disguised beneath thick sauces to make them palatable to aristocratic diners. This hide-the-veg trend was medieval avant-garde in a sense. You also find that some vegetables were seasonal luxuries. Early spring brought fresh greens eagerly awaited after long winters of preserved foods. These fleeting fresh moments were cherished but rare. A quirky tidbit in certain regions, medieval peasants used nettles as a nutritious green, cooking them into soups or stews. These stinging plants were rich in vitamins and minerals, but harvesting them required courage and skill. Despite the challenges, vegetables were vital for health and survival, especially when meat was scarce. But the overall flavor profile remained muted, shaped by cooking techniques and limited seasoning. So, as you picture this patchy garden of boiled humble greens, remember that medieval vegetables were both a blessing and a bore, a quiet hero of sustenance often overshadowed by grander but less tasty fare. You find yourself on the edge of a forest clearing, where a small group of villagers gather to discuss the elusive luxury of meat, something most of the population could only dream about. Meat was a symbol of wealth, power, and status in medieval society, and its scarcity made it all the more desirable. For peasants, meat was often a rare treat, while nobles flaunted their privilege with roasts and game that dazzled the senses, or at least tried to. The supply of meat was limited by several factors. Raising livestock required resources, land, and time, all of which were tightly controlled by the feudal system. Many peasants were allowed only a few animals like chickens or pigs, primarily for household use. Large herds of cattle or sheep belonged to the lord, who regulated hunting rights fiercely. Trespassing into the lord's hunting grounds to poach game could result in harsh penalties, making access to wild meat a risky venture. You might be surprised to learn that pork was the most commonly consumed meat for peasants, partly because pigs were easier to raise in small spaces and could forage for themselves. Beef was rarer and considered more prestigious, while lamb and mutton appeared in limited amounts, mostly in wealthier households. Preserving meat was a constant challenge, leading to heavy salting or smoking that altered flavor and texture. Fresh meat was a luxury that often vanished quickly, turning into something tough and salty before you could really enjoy it. Hunting was more than a food source. It was a social ritual and political statement. Nobles hosted elaborate hunts that were as much about displaying power and control as about procuring food. These events were highly choreographed spectacles, complete with falcons, hounds, and ceremonial gear. Historians still argue whether these hunts provided significant food or mainly served as entertainment and status display. Interestingly, certain meats were reserved for particular classes or occasions. Venison was prized by the elite, while offal, the internal organs, was more common in peasant diets. Offal was often stewed or potted to make it edible, a practice born from necessity rather than choice. You might chuckle at the odd medieval recipes calling for ingredients like swan, peacock, or even beaver. These exotic meats were more about showmanship than flavor, reinforcing the nobles' wealth and connections. Religious fasting rules heavily influenced meat consumption. On many days of the year, especially during Lent, eating meat was forbidden, pushing people toward fish or vegetarian meals. This complicated the already limited access to meat and added a layer of spiritual obligation to dietary restrictions. A quirky tidbit: in some regions, the tongue, heart, and brains were considered delicacies, prepared with spices and sauces to mask their strong flavors. You might wonder if medieval diners truly enjoyed these, or simply ate them because they were available. Despite the allure, meat was not a daily staple for most. The economics of land use, social hierarchy, and religious observance all conspired to make it a rare and coveted part of medieval life. The taste, when available, was often compromised by preservation methods, leading to chewy, salty morsels rather than succulent roasts. So, as you imagine savoring a rare piece of salted pork or watching a noble's falcon snatch a partridge, remember that meat's medieval story is one of scarcity, symbolism, and survival rather than simple pleasure. You find yourself in a cool, dimly lit room where large wheels of cheese and churned butter sit alongside wooden bowls and clay pots. Dairy products played a surprisingly complex role in medieval diets, acting as both everyday staples and ingredients wrapped in layers of regional tradition and occasional mystery. From fresh milk to aged cheeses, dairy was both a source of nutrition and a culinary challenge. Milk, when fresh, was a precious commodity, but notoriously difficult to keep unspoiled. Without refrigeration, it had to be consumed quickly, or turned into other products like butter or cheese. Most peasants and villagers drank milk from cows, goats, or sheep, depending on local farming practices. Fresh milk was often reserved for children or the sick, while adults might consume it less frequently due to lactose intolerance, which many medieval Europeans likely experienced. Butter was a prized fat used in cooking and baking, especially in Northern Europe where olive oil was scarce. You can imagine the labor involved: hours of churning cream by hand to produce enough butter to cook with or preserve. Butter's flavor varied widely, often reflecting the diet of the animals and the skill of the maker. Sometimes it was fresh and creamy, other times it was rancid or overly salty. Historians still argue whether butter was primarily a cooking fat or also spread on bread as a daily practice. Cheese was another vital dairy product, with varieties ranging from soft, fresh curds to hard-aged wheels. Monasteries became centers of cheese-making innovation, refining techniques that allowed cheese to be stored for months. However, many cheeses were strong-smelling and had textures that might challenge modern tastes. Aged cheeses could be crumbly and sharp, while fresh cheeses were mild but perishable. The role of dairy extended beyond taste. In some regions, dairy was considered medicinal. Warm milk with herbs might be prescribed for ailments, and butter was used topically for skin and wound care. This dual function blurred the lines between food and medicine, a common theme in medieval culinary culture. A quirky tidbit: some medieval cheeses were intentionally made with additives like ash or nettles to influence texture and flavor, resulting in unique but sometimes bizarre outcomes. You might think that sounds adventurous, but for medieval eaters it was just another part of daily life. Milk and dairy products also had seasonal rhythms. Spring and early summer brought fresh milk in abundance, but by winter, supplies dwindled, and preserved products like cheese and butter became essential. This cycle influenced menu planning and food availability throughout the year. Dairy was not without its controversies. Some religious texts questioned its consumption during fasting periods, and there was debate over whether butter or cheese counted as meat or animal products forbidden during certain days. The answers were inconsistent, reflecting the complex intersection of faith and food. Despite these complexities, dairy products added important calories and fats to the medieval diet, balancing the heavy reliance on grains and vegetables. Their textures and flavors, while often rustic or strong, provided variety in an otherwise monotonous food landscape. So, as you imagine spreading a thick layer of butter on a coarse slice of bread or nibbling on a crumbly wheel of cheese, remember that dairy was both a staple and a luxury, nourishing, medicinal, and occasionally puzzling. You're in a small, smoky kitchen, where a pot of thick, dark honey simmers gently over the fire. Sweetness in medieval times was rare and precious, much more than the everyday treat it is today. Honey and later sugar were the primary sources of sweetness, and their scarcity shaped how often and how much sweetness graced the medieval palate. Honey was the original sweetener, gathered painstakingly from wild or semi-domesticated bees. Beekeeping was a specialized skill, and honey was used not only to sweeten foods, but also as a medicinal ingredient and preservative. You might imagine honey dripping luxuriously over pastries or bread, but in reality, it was often mixed into thick sauces or beverages, masking stronger flavors, or adding a touch of luxury to otherwise plain dishes. Sugar arrived later, and was initially even more precious than honey. Imported from the Middle East and Asia, sugar was a luxury only the wealthy could afford. Early sugar was coarse, unrefined, and often colored with impurities, giving it an odd taste and appearance. Historians still argue whether medieval Europeans truly enjoyed sugar, or whether it was valued more for its rarity and novelty. Medieval desserts were uncommon and usually reserved for feasts or special occasions. They often consisted of fruit preserved in honey or sugar-spiced cakes or custards. The sweetness was intense but sometimes harsh, lacking the delicate balance modern confectioners strive for. You can almost hear the murmur of surprise when a bite was unexpectedly sugary, a rare treat that lingered long after the meal ended. The texture of sweet foods was also challenging. Pastries were dense and heavy, often made with coarse flour and plenty of fat, but little leavening. Imagine biting into a sticky, crumbly cake flavored with honey and spices like cinnamon and cloves, delicious by medieval standards, but likely a far cry from the airy sweets you know today. A quirky tidbit: in some regions, medieval cooks experimented with mead, an alcoholic beverage made from fermented honey and water. Mead was both a social drink and a medicinal tonic, often flavored with herbs and spices, to mask its sometimes rough edges. The high cost of sweetness meant that most people went without. Peasants might never taste honey or sugar, relying instead on naturally sweet fruits like apples or berries when they were in season. Even then, fresh fruit was a luxury, and preserved fruits were rare and usually reserved for the upper classes. Interestingly, the desire for sweetness drove trade and culinary experimentation throughout the medieval period. The quest to obtain and use sugar influenced economic and social connections between Europe and the wider world, laying the groundwork for future culinary revolutions. Historians still debate how medieval tastes evolved and how much sweetness was genuinely enjoyed versus tolerated or prized solely for its rarity. But it's clear that sugar and honey were not just ingredients, they were symbols of wealth, indulgence, and the promise of something better. So, as you savor the idea of that rare, sweet bite, remember that medieval sweetness was a luxury, a hint of pleasure amid the otherwise bland and often challenging world of medieval food. You step back into the medieval kitchen, a space filled with flickering candlelight and the ever-present haze of smoke. Cooking technology was rudimentary at best, a far cry from the precise ovens and stovetops you might take for granted today. Open hearths, simple iron pots, and wooden spoons define the cooking landscape, and this more than any single ingredient shaped the taste, texture, and overall experience of medieval food. The primary cooking method was boiling or stewing over an open fire. Pots were hung on iron hooks or set directly on hot embers. This lack of temperature control meant food was often overcooked in some areas and undercooked in others. You can imagine the frustration of the cook, trying to keep a pot simmering evenly without modern tools, while also managing the smoke and the fluctuating heat of a wood fire. Roasting was popular in noble households, but was a tricky affair. Large spits were turned manually, or with rudimentary mechanisms cooking meat unevenly, and often resulting in burnt crusts and raw centers. This contributed to the tough, chewy meat texture many associate with medieval cuisine. The spectacle of roasting, however, was a prized element of feasts, signaling status rather than culinary perfection. Baking was limited to communal ovens in villages or castles, and access was often restricted. Baking bread was a complex and communal event involving precise timing and skill that many peasants lacked. Pies and pastries were more common among the wealthy, who could afford skilled bakers. And even then, these were often dense and heavy, reflecting the limited leavening technology of the time. You might be amused to learn that medieval cooks sometimes used heated stones or ashes to cook foods, wrapping items in leaves or cloth, and burying them near the fire. This method, called ash cooking, could impart smoky flavors, but was unpredictable in results. The available cookware was mostly iron, which could react with acidic foods like vinegar or wine, altering taste, and sometimes causing discoloration. This added an unintended metallic note to some dishes. Copper and bronze cookware were rare and reserved for the wealthy. Fuel sources were limited, wood was primary, but charcoal was used in some regions. The constant need to feed the fire made cooking labor-intensive and time-consuming, with cooks juggling multiple pots and pans in cramped, smoky spaces. Food preparation tools were primitive knives, wooden spoons, and simple grinding stones. Without refrigeration, preserving and preparing ingredients demanded ingenuity, but often compromised flavor. Historians still argue how much the limitations of cooking technology affected medieval cuisine's reputation. Some suggest that, given better tools, medieval food might have tasted very different, while others argue that ingredient quality and social factors played a bigger role. A quirky tidbit: in some castles, the kitchen was separated from the dining hall by thick walls, not just for safety, but to keep the smoke and odors away from guests. Yet the lingering scent of smoke often traveled into the dining room, anyway coloring the entire feast experience. So, as you imagine stirring a thick stew over a flickering fire with no thermostat or timer, remember that medieval cooking was as much about managing the elements as about the food itself. The smoky, unevenly cooked, sometimes burnt or raw results were an inevitable part of the culinary adventure. You reach for a pinch of salt, that tiny mineral crystal that was both a lifesaver and a flavor saboteur in medieval cooking. Salt played a dual role. It was essential for preserving food, but often made dishes overly salty, confusing medieval taste buds and creating a paradox that defined much of the era's cuisine. Salt was a precious commodity mined from salt pans or harvested from evaporated seawater, then traded over long distances. Its value was so high that it was sometimes called white gold. This importance made salt both a practical necessity and a luxury item, affecting everything from peasant diets to royal banquets. You might be surprised that the primary use of salt wasn't seasoning, but preservation. Meat, fish, and even vegetables were heavily salted to prevent spoilage, especially during winter or long journeys. However, the heavy salting often left food tough and unpalatable, a bitter price for extending shelf life. Cooking with salted ingredients posed challenges. Medieval cooks had to balance the need to keep food edible with the risk of making it too salty to enjoy. Since desalting methods were limited, heavily salted foods could dominate the flavor profile of entire meals. Salt also influenced bread making. Bakers used salt sparingly due to its cost. So many loaves were bland and quick to spoil. Without adequate salt, bread lost its flavor and firmness, contributing to the tough textures peasants endured. Interestingly, salt was intertwined with health beliefs. Some thought it could stimulate appetite or cure ailments, while others feared excessive salt might cause illness. These contradictory views shaped how salt was used or avoided in various recipes. A quirky tidbit: medieval salt taxes and monopolies caused social unrest in some regions. Salt shortages or price spikes led to protests and even rebellion, highlighting how vital this mineral was beyond the kitchen. You also learn that salt's preservation powers were sometimes harnessed creatively. Fish like herring and cod were pickled in salt to create staple foods that could be transported across Europe. These salted fish were often eaten during fasting periods when meat was forbidden. Historians still debate how much salt shaped medieval flavor preferences. Some argue that the overuse of salt masked poor ingredient quality, while others suggest it was a cultural preference that influenced the cuisine's development. So, as you imagine sprinkling salt over your meal, remember that medieval cooks faced a delicate balancing act, preserving food enough to survive the seasons, while risking overwhelming the natural flavors with salt's harsh bite. Salt was survival and seasoning, a paradox that made medieval food memorable for reasons beyond just taste. You approach the riverside market where baskets overflow with fish of all kinds: freshwater carp, pike, eels, and the prized saltwater cod and herring brought by merchants from distant seas. Fish played a complex role in medieval diets shaped by geography, religion, and seasonal restrictions, adding both variety and challenges to the medieval table. For many medieval people, especially those living inland or near rivers, freshwater fish was a crucial protein source. Carp and pike were common catches, often farmed in monastery ponds or caught in local waters. Saltwater fish like cod were highly prized, but had to be preserved with salt for transport inland, resulting in tough, salty textures that tested the palate. Religious fasting rules profoundly influenced fish consumption. During Lent and other fasting periods, meat was forbidden, but fish was allowed, making it a staple for millions of observant Christians. This religious demand led to an intricate fish trade network and a seasonal rhythm to medieval diets. Some regions even developed elaborate fish recipes and festivals centered around fish. You might be surprised that many medieval cooks struggled with fish preparation. The strong, muddy taste of freshwater fish, or the heavily salted saltwater varieties, required masking with spices, herbs, and thick sauces. Historians still argue whether medieval people preferred fresh fish, or if salted varieties were more common out of necessity. Interestingly, fish was also surrounded by superstition. Some believed certain fish had magical properties or should be eaten only on specific days. Oddly, some medieval texts warned against eating fish with scales, while others extolled their virtues. This mix of belief and practicality shaped how fish was used in kitchens. A quirky tidbit: monk communities became experts in fish farming and preparation, maintaining ponds and passing down recipes that combined preservation and flavor. Their knowledge helped sustain communities during fasting seasons. Fish was often cooked by boiling, frying, or baking, but the limitations of medieval cooking technology meant textures could be rubbery or dry. Sauces were applied liberally to mask flavors, but the quality of the fish itself was the real challenge. You might chuckle at medieval recipes calling for unusual ingredients like aspic or jelly poured over fish dishes, a technique meant to impress, but sometimes resulting in strange textures. Despite the challenges, fish was an essential component of medieval nutrition, especially for the pious. Its availability varied, but its role in diet and culture was undeniable. So, as you picture a salted cod soaking in brine or a freshly caught carp simmering in a pot, Remember that fish was both a blessing and a burden, a necessary, sometimes puzzling part of medieval life. You find yourself amidst the solemn rhythm of medieval religious life, where fasting and feast days dictated not only your spiritual calendar, but also your stomach's experience. The medieval diet was deeply entwined with faith and religious rules, imposed complex eating patterns that shaped both what and when people ate, often limiting variety and joy in the process. Fasting days were numerous: Wednesdays, Fridays, Lent, Advent, and other holy days amounting to almost half the year. On these days, consumption of meat, dairy, and sometimes even fish was forbidden, pushing people towards simple plant-based meals. You can imagine the challenge of maintaining nutrition and flavor when your options were so severely restricted. During fasting, people relied heavily on legumes, vegetables, and fish, with fish often seen as a lesser animal that could be eaten without breaking the fast. Yet the monotony of these meals could be soul-crushing. Historians still argue whether fasting was primarily a spiritual discipline or if it served economic and social functions by conserving scarce resources. The fasting rules created a diet with sharp contrasts. Feast days, celebrations of saints' holidays, or royal occasions were marked by abundant food, rich meats, and elaborate preparation. These days broke the routine of austerity, but were often infrequent and fleeting. For most, the anticipation of feasts was part survival strategy, part social cohesion. Interestingly, fasting practices varied widely by region and class. Nobles might circumvent rules with dispensations or secret indulgences, while peasants adhered more strictly due to communal enforcement and lack of alternatives. Some religious orders even developed unique fasting rules that influenced local diets. You might find it amusing that fasting led to creative culinary inventions: mock meats made from vegetables, nut-based sauces, and elaborate fish dishes designed to mimic the forbidden flavors. These innovations highlight medieval cooks' adaptability, despite restrictions. A quirky tidbit: some fasting rules forbade not just meat, but all animal products, including eggs and dairy, creating even greater dietary challenges. This stricter fasting was more common among monks and nuns, whose diets were among the most austere. Religious fasting also influenced the calendar of food production and trade. Markets adjusted their offerings to fasting seasons, and food preservation methods were aligned to ensure availability during restricted periods. Despite the hardships, fasting was deeply embedded in medieval life, shaping culinary traditions and daily habits. It reinforced social and spiritual identity, making food a medium of faith as much as survival. So, as you sit with a plain lentil stew on a fasting day, remember, it's more than sustenance. It's a link to centuries of belief, discipline, and frankly, culinary sacrifice. You step into a medieval village market where food is not just sustenance, but wrapped in layers of superstition and belief. The medieval mindset was riddled with food taboos and curious fears that shaped what people dared to eat or avoid. These beliefs often muddled nutrition with magic, making the act of eating a mysterious, sometimes risky ritual. Certain foods were thought to carry spiritual or physical dangers. For example, eating eggs on specific days was believed to cause health problems or bad luck. Some fruits and vegetables were avoided because they were linked to witches or evil spirits. This blend of superstition and diet could mean that perfectly edible foods were shunned for generations. You might find it amusing that garlic, now a kitchen staple, was once thought to ward off vampires and evil, making it popular for protection rather than taste. Conversely, some herbs were feared for their supposed magical properties and were rarely consumed despite being abundant. Animals were also wrapped in taboo. Eating horse meat was widely forbidden or frowned upon in many Christian regions, linked to pagan rituals and considered unclean. Yet in some areas it was eaten during famines out of necessity. Historians still argue how widespread such taboos were and how they varied regionally. A quirky tidbit: some medieval texts warned against mixing certain foods like fish and dairy, claiming it could cause illness or moral corruption. These food combination rules influenced meal planning and culinary experimentation, or the lack thereof. Food taboos extended to the social realm as well. Certain foods were considered inappropriate for particular classes or genders. For example, some believed that women should avoid rich or spicy foods lest they become too lustful or unruly, a reflection of broader societal controls over behavior. Religious dietary laws added another layer of complexity, especially in multi-faith regions. Jewish and Muslim communities adhered to kosher and halal rules, influencing local markets and food availability. This intersection of faith and food created both tension and rich cultural exchange. Despite their irrationality by modern standards, these taboos played a crucial role in medieval life. They governed food safety, social order, and spiritual well-being in a world where scientific understanding was limited. Breaking a taboo could invite social ostracism or worse. So, as you mull over this quirky web of food, fears remember that medieval people navigated their diets not just with taste buds, but with an entire worldview that turned eating into a complex dance of belief, caution, and culture. You sit before a steaming bowl of medieval stew, but instead of a delicate broth, you find a thick, gloopy sauce that dominates every bite. Sauces in medieval cooking were well an acquired taste, or often just acquired by necessity. These thick, often strange concoctions frequently overwhelmed the ingredients they accompanied, rather than enhancing them, leading to what some might politely call culinary confusion. Sauces were usually heavy mixtures of vinegar, wine, honey, and an array of spices all cooked down into dense, syrupy globs. They were applied liberally to meat, fish, and even vegetables, partly to mask off flavors, and partly because thick sauces were fashionable among the upper classes. You might picture a delicate gravy, but medieval sauces were more like sticky, sweet and sour globs that clung stubbornly to your fork. The composition of sauces was guided by a mixture of taste preferences and medicinal beliefs. Vinegar was thought to aid digestion and ward off disease, so it was a common base. Honey added sweetness but also preserved the sauce. The heavy use of spices reflected both status and the desire to cover up less than fresh ingredients. Interestingly, sauces were also used to create visual spectacle. Their bright colors achieved with ingredients like saffron or blood made dishes more appealing to the eye, compensating for the often dull appearance of the main ingredients. This was part of the medieval feast's emphasis on show over taste. You might chuckle at recipes calling for sauces thickened with ground nuts, breadcrumbs, or even crushed flowers. These added texture but often resulted in a pasty mouthfeel. Historians still argue whether these thick sauces were truly enjoyed or endured as part of the dining ritual. A quirky tidbit in some medieval courts, chefs competed to create the most elaborate and bizarre sauces, sometimes incorporating ingredients like ambergris, a whale secretion, or exotic spices to impress nobles. The bizarre combinations sometimes made sauces more memorable than the meat they covered. Sauces also helped stretch food, making small portions feel more substantial. When meat was scarce, a heavily sauced dish could satisfy the eye and stomach more effectively than a plain cut. Despite their odd textures and flavors, sauces were a crucial part of medieval cuisine. They reflected the era's culinary aesthetics and social dynamics, turning every meal into a complex sensory experience, whether or not that experience was always pleasant. So, as you dip into this thick spice sauce, remember that medieval cooks weren't just feeding bodies. They were crafting statements of wealth, health, and artistry, even if the results sometimes baffled the taste buds. You raise a heavy wooden mug filled with ale, the frothy head, spilling slightly over the rim as you settle down after a hard day's work. Ale and beer were the lifeblood of medieval drinking culture, not just pleasurable refreshments, but essential components of daily nutrition and hydration. Their ubiquity in medieval life shaped meals, social interactions, and even health. Ale was typically brewed from barley or other grains, often with little or no hops, resulting in a sweeter, less bitter drink than modern beers. Small beer with low alcohol content was a common beverage consumed by all ages, including children. Its mild fermentation killed harmful microbes in water, making it safer than the often contaminated village wells or streams. Drinking ale was as much about practicality as enjoyment. The calories and nutrients from grains made it a valuable supplement to often sparse diets, especially for laborers. You can imagine medieval workers starting their day with a pint of small beer for sustenance, a far cry from today's coffee culture. Alehouses and taverns served as social hubs, places for news gossip and community bonding. The communal drinking culture reinforced social hierarchies, with different establishments catering to various classes. Nobles drank stronger ales or imported wines, but for the common folk, ale was a daily necessity. Despite its importance, ale was far from refined. It was often cloudy, yeasty, and sour, lacking the crispness or clarity of modern beers. The brewing process was variable, with each batch reflecting local ingredients, water quality, and brewer skill. Historians still debate how consistent medieval ale was across regions and seasons. You might smile at the medieval custom of alewives, women who brewed and sold ale from their homes, forming an essential part of local economies. Brewing was both a domestic duty and a small business, especially for widows or those without land. Wine, while prized in southern Europe, was less common in northern regions due to climate limitations, when consumed wine was often diluted with water and heavily spiced or heated to create mulled drinks. This practice was as much about preservation and warmth as taste. Alcohol's role extended beyond meals. It was used medicinally, socially, and religiously. Some believed ale had healing properties, while others cautioned against excess. The medieval world was no stranger to drunkenness, and drinking habits could be both celebrated and condemned. A quirky tidbit: some medieval recipes included ale as a cooking ingredient used to tenderize meats or add flavor to stews and bread. Ale's versatility extended beyond the mug. So, as you take a slow sip of your imaginary mug of ale, remember, it was more than a drink. It was a vital part of medieval life, weaving together sustenance, culture, and community in a way water never could. You step into a medieval kitchen and are immediately confronted by a thick haze, not just smoke, but the pervasive presence of poor hygiene. Medieval kitchen hygiene was, to put it kindly, a bit lacking by modern standards, and this had a direct impact on food quality, safety, and overall taste. The myths and realities of cleanliness, or the absence of it, help explain why medieval food often left a bad impression. Running water was scarce, and washing hands or utensils was infrequent, and sometimes seen as unnecessary. Kitchens were often grimy spaces with open fires attracting flies, rodents, and other pests. Food scraps piled up quickly, and the tools and surfaces used to prepare meals were rarely sanitized. You might imagine a modern kitchen sparkling with stainless steel, but medieval kitchens were rough-hewn wooden and perpetually dirty. Cross-contamination was common. Meat was prepared on the same boards as vegetables, and raw and cooked foods might share the same pots or knives. This unfortunate practice led to widespread foodborne illness, a major cause of sickness in medieval times. Historians still argue about how medieval people understood or dealt with these risks. You might be surprised that despite these challenges, some medieval cooks developed surprisingly effective cleaning rituals. Vinegar herbs like rosemary and thyme and smoke were sometimes used to mask odors or disinfect surfaces. These methods were more about perception and ritual than actual germ control, but they reveal an awareness, albeit limited, of the importance of cleanliness. Rodents and insects were constant threats. Rats were not just nuisances, but carriers of disease and frequent thieves of stored grain and food. Baskets of grain might be covered with cloth or hung from ceilings to keep them safe, but infestations were common. You might chuckle imagining medieval cooks swatting flies while stirring a pot, but this was a daily reality. A quirky tidbit: some medieval recipes include instructions to wash meat in wine or vinegar before cooking, an early attempt at reducing spoilage or contamination. Whether this was effective or simply superstition remains debated. The lack of refrigeration compounded hygiene issues. Leftover food was often reheated multiple times, increasing the risk of spoilage. Without proper storage, meals could quickly become breeding grounds for bacteria. Personal hygiene was similarly variable. Bathing was less frequent than today, and the use of perfumes or aromatic herbs sometimes substituted for washing. The pervasive smells of kitchens, animals, and humans mingled in a potent stew that affected the dining experience. Despite these grim conditions, medieval people managed to live, work, and eat in this environment. Their resilience was remarkable, but the consequences for taste and health were undeniable. So, as you imagine the smoky, buzzing kitchen filled with grime and flies, remember that medieval food was as much a battle against dirt and disease as it was about flavor, a struggle that shaped its notorious reputation. You step cautiously into the wild, where foraging for food was as much about necessity as adventure, and sometimes danger. Medieval people supplemented their diets by gathering wild plants, berries, nuts, and herbs, adding variety to otherwise monotonous meals. But foraging was a risky game, and the bounty of the forest came with its own set of challenges. The wild offered tempting delicacies like mushrooms, wild garlic, and berries, but distinguishing edible from poisonous was a skill passed down orally and through trial and error. Eating the wrong plant could mean sickness or death, a grim gamble that made foraging a dangerous but essential activity. Historians still debate how extensively peasants relied on foraged foods versus cultivated crops. Some wild plants like nettles and dandelions were nutritious, but required careful preparation to neutralize bitterness or toxins. These greens often found their way into soups or stews, adding flavor and vitamins otherwise lacking in the diet. A quirky tidbit: medieval herbals contained recipes for concocting herbal remedies and culinary uses, but many recipes warned of the dangers of misidentification. Foraging was as much about herbal medicine as food gathering. Seasonal changes dictated the availability of wild foods. Spring and summer brought fresh greens and berries, while autumn offered nuts and mushrooms. Winter foraging was minimal and risky, forcing reliance on stored and preserved foods. Foraging was also tied to local folklore and superstition. Certain plants were believed to have magical properties, while others were thought to attract evil spirits. These beliefs influenced what was gathered and consumed. Communities often regulated access to nearby forests and commons, balancing the need for wild food with property rights and conservation. Trespassing could lead to fines or punishment, adding a social dimension to foraging. While foraged foods added needed diversity, they were no panacea. The risk, scarcity, and effort involved meant that wild foods supplemented rather than replaced staple grains and vegetables. So, as you imagine picking berries or gathering herbs in the forest, remember that foraging was a lifeline tinged with peril, a wild card in the medieval diet that could brighten or end a meal. You walk alongside a hunting party, the crack of bows and the bang of hounds filling the air. Hunting in medieval times was less about filling stomachs and more about demonstrating power, status, and privilege. The chase was a ritual, a theater of aristocratic dominance over both nature and people, with food playing a supporting role in this elaborate social drama. Hunting grounds, or forests reserved for the nobility, were carefully managed to ensure a steady supply of game deer, boar, hare, and birds like pheasants and partridges. Access to these lands was strictly controlled, with peasants forbidden from hunting and punished severely for poaching. Hunting rights were a marker of social rank and economic control. The act of hunting was ceremonial. Nobles dressed in elaborate attire, rode horses, and employed teams of hunters and trained dogs. Falconry was a prestigious sport, combining hunting with art and skill. While the meat from hunts fed the aristocracy, the spectacle was often more important than the catch itself. You might chuckle at the elaborate feasts following hunts, where the presentation of game was as theatrical as the chase. Roast boars decorated with apples in their mouths and peacocks presented with their feathers intact were common. These displays reinforced status and wealth, creating a sensory feast that extended beyond taste. Despite the grandeur, hunting was not a reliable source of daily food. The effort and expense limited it to occasional events rather than routine meals. For peasants, wild game was generally inaccessible, and their diets relied on domesticated animals or preserved foods. A quirky tidbit: some medieval hunting manuals included detailed instructions not just on catching game, but on etiquette and how to impress guests during hunts. These manuals read as much like social guides as hunting advice. Hunting also had spiritual and symbolic dimensions. Animals were associated with virtues or vices, and hunting was framed as a noble pursuit aligned with chivalric ideals. This elevated hunting from mere food gathering to a cultural institution. Historians still argue about how hunting influenced medieval food culture, whether it spurred culinary innovation or remained a largely performative activity, disconnected from everyday eating. So, as you imagine the thrill of the chase and the pomp of the feast, remember that medieval hunting was a blend of sport, status, and sustenance, an elaborate dance that shaped both plate and palace. You find yourself tracing the dusty caravan trails that stretch from Europe to the exotic East routes, bustling with merchants trading spices, silk, and stories from distant lands. Medieval culinary culture was slowly, sometimes painfully, shaped by these connections, as influences from the Middle East and beyond trickled into European kitchens, introducing new flavors and ingredients that challenge established tastes. The spice trade wasn't just about flavor. It was an economic and cultural phenomenon linking continents. Through complex networks of traders, spices like cinnamon, saffron, and cardamom arrived in European markets, bringing hints of warmth and mystery to an otherwise bland culinary scene. However, access was limited, and these spices were mostly confined to the wealthy shaping elite, cooking far more than peasant fare. You might be surprised that many medieval recipes borrowed heavily from Arabic and Persian culinary traditions, incorporating nuts, dried fruits, and sweet-sour flavor combinations unfamiliar to European palates. This fusion sometimes created dishes that seemed exotic or perplexing to locals, mixing flavors in ways that defied later culinary norms. The influence extended beyond ingredients. Techniques such as stewing and the use of aromatic sauces found their way into European kitchens via these cultural exchanges. You might imagine medieval chefs scratching their heads over unfamiliar spices, but also experimenting boldly with new combinations. A quirky tidbit: sugar introduced through these trade routes was originally treated as a medicinal substance before becoming a culinary staple. The concept of sugar castles and elaborate confectionery grew from these cross-cultural influences. Yet the assimilation of these foreign flavors was uneven. While some regions embraced new tastes, others resisted clinging to traditional cooking styles. Historians still argue how deeply Eastern influences penetrated medieval European cuisine, and whether they sparked lasting change or remained fleeting curiosities. Religious and political tensions also complicated culinary exchange. Dietary laws and social norms affected which foods were accepted or rejected, shaping the pace and direction of culinary evolution. So, as you envision the spice-laden caravans crossing deserts and mountains, remember that medieval food was not just local fare, but part of a global story, a tale of trade, taste, and transformation that slowly reshaped what Europeans ate and how they thought about flavor. You hold a small, gritty lump of sugar, a substance so rare and precious in medieval Europe that it was often reserved for royalty and the richest merchants. The rise of sugar in medieval cuisine was an uneven journey, initially exotic, confusing, and far from the refined sweetness we know today. This early experimentation with sugar reveals much about medieval tastes and trade dynamics. Sugar arrived in Europe via crusaders and trade routes from the Middle East, initially as coarse, unrefined crystals that bore little resemblance to the white granules in your modern kitchen. Its texture was gritty, its flavor sometimes bitter, and it was often colored with impurities. This made early sugar a challenge to incorporate into dishes. Because of its rarity and high cost, sugar was used sparingly, more as a status symbol than a culinary staple. It adorned desserts at banquets and was mixed with spices to create complex sweet and sour sauces. The use of sugar was often more about impressing guests and signaling wealth than enhancing flavor subtly. You might find it amusing that medieval cooks experimented with sugar in ways that seem odd, now adding it to meat dishes, using it in medicinal syrups, or combining it with vinegar and spices to create sauces that bewilder modern palates. Historians still argue how much medieval people actually enjoyed sugar, or if its value lay primarily in its novelty and rarity. Some suggest that early consumers struggled with the taste, while others embraced it enthusiastically as a luxurious indulgence. A quirky tidbit: sugar was sometimes molded into elaborate shapes, sugar sculptures, and confections that decorated feasts and impressed guests. These early displays of sugar art were as much about spectacle as taste. The arrival of sugar also influenced social and economic dynamics, fueling trade, encouraging plantations and colonies, and eventually transforming diets worldwide, though these later effects came centuries after its medieval introduction. So, as you imagine that gritty lump melting slowly on your tongue, remember that sugar's medieval story is one of transformation, from a puzzling luxury to the sweet staple that revolutionized global cuisine. You step into a medieval herb garden, where rows of parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme thrive under the careful watch of gardeners and monks. Herbs were the unsung heroes of medieval cooking, serving dual roles in flavoring food and treating ailments, often with mixed success. Their presence was as much about tradition and health beliefs as about taste. Herbs were used to season dishes, especially when spices were scarce or too expensive. While they added some freshness and aroma, their flavors were generally mild compared to the exotic spices favored by the wealthy. Stews, soups, and sauces often included chopped herbs to brighten the palate or mask less desirable tastes. You might find it fascinating that many herbs were believed to possess medicinal properties. Rosemary was thought to improve memory, sage to aid digestion, and thyme to promote courage. This belief blurred the line between food and medicine, leading cooks to add herbs as health boosters rather than purely for flavor. The harvesting and drying of herbs were seasonal activities, with dried herbs stored for use in winter months, when fresh greens were unavailable. This preservation affected the potency and flavor, often resulting in weaker or earthier tastes. A quirky tidbit: some medieval recipes called for bizarre combinations of herbs and other ingredients like combining mint with rosewater, or sprinkling rue over meat to counteract supposed bad humors. These mixtures reveal the intricate relationship between culinary and medical thinking. Despite their benefits, herbs could be unpredictable. Overuse could overpower dishes, while poor quality or stale herbs added bitterness or unpleasant notes. Historians still argue whether the average medieval diner appreciated the subtlety of herbs or simply tolerated them as necessary. Herbs also played symbolic roles. They were associated with purity protection and spiritual well-being, often planted near homes or in monastery gardens to ward off evil. The knowledge of herb use was preserved and expanded in monastic scriptoria, where herbal manuals guided both cooks and healers. This dual legacy contributed to the slow evolution of European cuisine. So, as you inhale the scent of fresh herbs or sprinkle dried leaves into a stew, remember that medieval cooks weren't just seasoning food. They were blending tradition, health, and flavor into a complex cultural tapestry. You find yourself in a grand medieval banquet hall where the feast is as much a visual spectacle as a meal. Food presentation was taken seriously, but often at the expense of flavor. The emphasis was on impressing guests with color, form, and abundance, turning plates into theatrical displays that dazzled the eyes more than pleased the palate. Dishes were arranged with vibrant sauces, gilded decorations, and elaborate carvings, sometimes in the shapes of animals, mythical creatures, or heraldic symbols. The goal was to showcase wealth, creativity, and control over nature. You might imagine food as art, but in medieval times the artistry often overshadowed taste and texture. Trenchers, the stale bread plates we mentioned earlier, were also part of the presentation. They soaked up sauces and juices, becoming both a utensil and a platform for further edible decoration. Sometimes these bread plates were stacked or arranged to create towering structures that amazed guests but risked sogginess and mess. Color was a key aspect of presentation. Saffron spices and fruits were used to create vivid yellows, reds, and greens on the plate. Food color signaled rarity and expense, reinforcing social status. Yet these colors often came from ingredients that altered flavor in unexpected ways. You might be amused by the medieval penchant for surprises, hidden ingredients, fake foods, or subtleties that combine food with theatrical effects. Some banquets featured live birds released from pies or sugar sculptures that burst with scent, adding drama, but little culinary value. Historians still debate how much diners appreciated the elaborate presentations versus focusing on the food itself. Some suggest that the visual feast was essential to medieval dining culture, where food was a form of communication and power display. A quirky tidbit: some medieval cooks used food coloring made from minerals, or even crushed insects, resulting in vivid but occasionally off-putting hues. The pursuit of beauty sometimes led to unintended consequences for taste. Despite the focus on appearance, the actual flavors were often muted or masked by heavy sauces and preservation methods. Presentation was a strategy to distract from or compensate for these shortcomings. So, as you admire the intricate patterns and towering sculptures on a medieval table, remember that food was as much a stage as a meal, where beauty, status, and surprise often took precedence over simple enjoyment. You bite into a piece of medieval food and suddenly feel a familiar discomfort. The grim reality of foodborne illness was a constant threat in the Middle Ages. Without refrigeration, proper sanitation, or modern knowledge of bacteria, medieval food was a risky gamble for your stomach, contributing to widespread sickness and reinforcing the era's reputation for bad taste. Spoilage was common. Meats and dairy that weren't properly preserved could harbor harmful bacteria, leading to food poisoning. Fruits and vegetables, often washed in questionable water, or not at all, could carry parasites or toxins. The close quarters of kitchens and the lack of hygiene made contamination easy. Symptoms like stomach cramps, vomiting, and diarrhea were frequent and could be deadly, especially for children and the elderly. While people recognized that spoiled food caused illness, their explanations involved humors, curses, or divine punishment rather than microbes. Historians still debate how much medieval people understood food safety and how they tried to mitigate risks. Food was often reheated multiple times to mask spoilage or stretch meals, but this only increased the danger. Cross-contamination was rampant, and insects or rodents could infest stored grain or meat. You might be surprised that certain foods were believed to have protective properties against illness. Spices, vinegar, and alcohol were thought to purify food and prevent sickness, influencing their heavy use, even if the results were mixed. A quirky tidbit: some medieval households kept food testers who would sample dishes first to check for poison or spoilage, a practice both practical and a sign of distrust in food quality. Illness outbreaks sometimes affected entire communities, linked to contaminated food or water supplies. These events shaped social practices and contributed to the cautious, sometimes fearful approach to eating. Despite the risks, foodborne illness was an accepted part of life, tolerated as an unfortunate hazard of survival. This reality influenced cooking methods, ingredient choices, and the social context of meals. So, as you imagine nibbling cautiously at medieval fare, remember that every bite was a gamble, not just with flavor, but with your health, making medieval food an adventure in both taste and survival. You dip your spoon into a thick, greasy stew where fats and oils cling stubbornly to every morsel, adding richness, but also heaviness. Cooking fats in medieval times were limited and often unusual by today's standards, shaping the texture, flavor, and nutritional content of meals in ways that modern palates might find challenging. Animal fats like lard and tallow were the primary cooking fats available, derived from pigs, cows, and sheep. These fats were rendered down and stored for use throughout the year, especially in colder climates where plant oils were scarce. Their high smoke points made them suitable for frying and roasting, but their flavors were strong and could overpower dishes. Butter, as we've discussed, was prized but also variable in quality. It was used not just as a spread, but as a cooking fat, imparting a creamy texture, but sometimes turning rancid quickly. The shelf life of fats was a constant concern, and spoiled fat could ruin a meal. Plant-based oils like olive oil were known, but limited mostly to southern Europe due to climate, where available olive oil was prized for its lighter flavor and was often used in salad dressings or lighter cooking. Yet it remained rare and expensive in northern regions. You might be surprised to learn that medieval cooks sometimes used strange fats like goose or duck fat, prized for their richness, or even whale oil in coastal areas. These fats added unique flavors, but also contributed to the dense, heavy mouthfeel typical of medieval dishes. The scarcity and expense of fats meant they were used sparingly or reserved for special occasions. This limitation affected the calorie density of the diet, making fats an essential but precious nutrient. A quirky tidbit: medieval recipes, sometimes called for frying or cooking, with butter and lard mixed with spices or wine, creating complex flavor profiles that modern cooks rarely replicate. These combinations reflect both experimentation and the influence of status-driven culinary trends. Historians still debate the nutritional impact of these fats on medieval populations, considering the balance between energy needs and the risk of spoilage or illness. Despite the limitations, cooking fats were central to medieval cuisine. They provided flavor, texture, and essential calories, turning otherwise bland or tough ingredients into more satisfying fare. So, as you imagine the rich, greasy stew coating your tongue, remember that fats were both a luxury and necessity, shaping the medieval palate in subtle yet profound ways. You unroll a fragile parchment-bound cookbook from a monastery library, its pages filled with recipes that are as much cultural artifacts as culinary guides. Medieval cookbooks reveal a fascinating glimpse into the cuisine of the era, but their recipes often prioritize ceremony symbolism or medicinal qualities over taste, reflecting the complex intersection of culture, religion, and food. These early cookbooks were typically compiled by monks, aristocratic cooks, or apothecaries, blending culinary instructions with health advice and moral lessons. Their recipes often read more like ritual formulas than straightforward cooking guides, mixing ingredients in curious combinations, and sometimes including odd preparation steps that puzzle modern readers. You might be amused to find instructions for dishes like meat and jelly or swan boiled with spices and decorated with gold leaf. The emphasis on lavish presentation and symbolic ingredients often overshadowed practicality or flavor. Historians still argue whether these cookbooks represent everyday cooking or only the most extravagant meals for the elite. Many recipes rely on thick sauces, heavy use of spices, and preservation techniques that altered texture and taste. Measurements are vague and cooking times imprecise, reflecting an oral tradition and reliance on cooks' intuition rather than precise science. A quirky tidbit: some medieval cookbooks include remedies for ailments alongside recipes suggesting that food was seen as both nourishment and medicine. Dishes might be prepared to balance the humors or treat specific conditions, further complicating their culinary purpose. These cookbooks also reveal regional variations and the slow incorporation of foreign influences through trade and conquest. Ingredients like saffron, sugar, and exotic spices make appearances highlighting the connection between cuisine and global exchange. While fascinating historically, the cookbooks' focus on status, ritual, and health often meant that recipes were impractical or unappetizing by today's standards. Modern chefs attempting to recreate these dishes frequently find the flavors overwhelming or unbalanced. So, as you leaf through these ancient culinary texts, remember that medieval cookbooks were not just about food. They were cultural documents reflecting the beliefs, values, and complexities of a world far removed from our own. You break off a piece of bread only to find it stubbornly hard, more akin to a small brick than the soft loaves you're used to. Bread stalling was a constant battle in medieval kitchens, and the problem of horse bread looms large in the story of medieval food texture and quality. Bread was baked less frequently than today, often in communal ovens, and then stored for days or weeks. Without modern preservatives or packaging, bread quickly lost moisture, becoming dry and tough. Stale bread was an everyday reality, forcing people to find creative ways to make it edible again. Horse bread was the lowest quality bread, made from bran-dried peas and sometimes even acorns or other fillers. It was coarse, bitter, and primarily fed to working animals. However, in times of famine or hardship, desperate peasants sometimes resorted to eating horse bread themselves, a grim testament to the scarcity of food. To soften stale bread, medieval cooks would soak it in soups, stews, or wine, transforming it into a mushy base for meals. This technique was both practical and necessary, preventing waste and stretching limited resources. Interestingly, some recipes called for breadcrumbs to thicken sauces, or as a stuffing ingredient, showcasing bread's versatility despite its shortcomings. Bread's role extended beyond a staple. It was a multifunctional component in medieval cuisine. A quirky tidbit: some peasants carried stale bread in pouches to use as plates, or even as emergency rations, underscoring the centrality of bread in daily life. Historians still debate how much bread quality influenced health and nutrition in medieval populations. The low digestibility of coarse bread could contribute to malnutrition, while its caloric density made it a vital energy source. Despite the challenges, bread remained the staff of life, a necessary foundation of medieval diets that both sustained and frustrated eaters. So, as you gnaw on that stubborn loaf in your mind, remember that medieval bread was more than food. It was a survival tool, a social marker, and sometimes a test of endurance. You lean in to take a bite of what medieval cooks called dessert, but don't expect the delicate pastries or creamy sweets today. Medieval desserts were rare indulgences, often strange and unappetizing by modern standards, reflecting the era's limited access to sugar and the complex social meanings attached to sweetness. Desserts typically appeared only at feasts or special occasions reserved for the wealthy or clergy. Common treats included spiced fruit, preserves, honey-sweetened cakes, or custards thickened with eggs, and flavored with exotic spices like cinnamon and nutmeg. The texture was often dense and heavy, with flavors that today might seem overly sweet or oddly spiced. You might be amused to learn that many medieval desserts incorporated unusual ingredients such as rosewater, almond milk, or even breadcrumbs, creating a texture and taste foreign to modern palates. These combinations were born from available resources and culinary traditions that valued symbolism as much as flavor. The scarcity of sugar meant that honey was the primary sweetener, giving desserts a robust, earthy sweetness that lingered on the tongue. The arrival of refined sugar was just beginning, and its use in sweets was limited and experimental. Interestingly, medieval cooks sometimes used desserts to showcase wealth and sophistication. Elaborate sugar sculptures or marzipan figures decorated banquet tables, serving more as art than edible treats. These displays impressed guests, but often went uneaten. A quirky tidbit: in some regions, marchpane, early marzipan, was crafted into intricate shapes like animals or flowers, blending confectionery and artistry. These creations were both desserts and status symbols. Desserts also had medicinal associations. Sweet dishes were sometimes prescribed to balance humors or soothe ailments, blurring the line between food and medicine once again. Historians still debate how much medieval people truly enjoyed desserts versus accepting them as necessary parts of ritual or social obligation. So, as you savor the idea of a dense spiced honey cake, remember that medieval desserts were rare pleasures, complex, symbolic, and often challenging treats that punctuated the otherwise austere diet of the era. You find yourself within the quiet stone walls of a monastery where monks tend gardens, brew beer, and meticulously copy manuscripts. Monasteries played a crucial role in preserving and influencing medieval food culture, acting as centers of knowledge, agriculture, and culinary experimentation. Yet their impact on taste was a mixed blessing. Monks were among the few literate groups recording recipes, agricultural techniques, and medicinal uses of plants. Their gardens cultivated a variety of herbs, vegetables, and fruit trees, supplying not only their own kitchens, but also influencing local agriculture. Monastic brewing traditions gave rise to some of the earliest beers and ales, laying foundations for European brewing culture. However, monastic diets were often austere, guided by religious rules that limited indulgence. Meals were simple, repetitive, and designed to support spiritual discipline rather than culinary pleasure. Despite this, monasteries preserved culinary knowledge that might otherwise have been lost during turbulent times. You might find it intriguing that monks experimented with food preservation methods like pickling and drying, contributing to year-round food availability. Their herbal knowledge blended culinary and medicinal traditions, influencing both diet and health. A quirky tidbit: some monasteries produced early versions of cheese and bread that gained reputations for quality and influenced regional cuisine. These products sometimes funded monastic communities through trade. Historians still argue whether monasteries served as innovators, improving medieval taste, or custodians maintaining tradition without significant culinary advancement. While monastic influence helped stabilize food culture, the tastes developed were often subdued, reflecting the spiritual priorities of monastic life. So, as you imagine the monks' quiet meals of simple bread, cheese, and beer, remember that monasteries were both guardians of food knowledge and examples of culinary restraint. A paradox shaping medieval eating habits. You find yourself in a dimly lit hall where a group of nobles and servants observe strict rules about how to eat, what to say, and how to behave at the table. Medieval social etiquette surrounding food was complex and often joyless, turning the simple act of eating into a performance governed by rigid conventions. Meals were highly structured events, especially in noble households. Seating arrangements reflected social hierarchy, with the lord at the head of the table and guests positioned according to rank. The way you handled your knife, spoke between bites, or even wiped your mouth was under scrutiny. Breaking these unwritten rules could result in embarrassment or worse. You might be surprised to learn that table manners were not just about politeness, but also about maintaining order in a time when social ranks were strictly enforced. Eating in public was a political act as much as a personal necessity. The use of shared plates, communal trenchers, and limited utensils added to the complexity. You had to be mindful of hygiene and propriety, avoiding behaviors considered vulgar or greedy. A quirky tidbit: in some courts, elaborate hand-washing rituals were performed before and during meals, accompanied by attendants pouring scented water, a practice blending cleanliness with ceremony. Religious observance also influenced etiquette, with prayers before and after meals and restrictions on certain foods during fasting. Historians still debate how much genuine enjoyment medieval diners derived from their meals versus enduring social obligations. Despite the constraints, meals were opportunities for networking, displaying wealth, and reinforcing alliances. So, as you imagine carefully navigating the social minefield of a medieval feast, remember that eating was never just about food. It was about power, control, and tradition. You stroll through the bustling streets of a medieval town where the market stalls overflow with a more diverse array of foods than found in rural villages. Urban centers offered greater variety, bringing together ingredients from near and far, but quality still often lagged behind modern standards. City markets featured fresh produce, bread, cheese, meat, fish, spices, and preserved goods, thanks to better trade connections and more frequent supply. You can almost hear the vendors' calls selling apples from the orchard, salted herring from coastal traders, or dried herbs imported from distant lands. Despite this diversity, food safety and quality were inconsistent. Urban crowding, poor sanitation, and the rapid turnover of goods meant that spoilage and contamination were common. You might spot flies buzzing around open stalls, or notice how quickly fresh fish loses its appeal in the heat. The urban diet was shaped by social class and economic means. Wealthy merchants and officials could afford imported spices, refined bread, and fresh meats, while artisans and laborers relied more on staples like pottage and bread. Markets reflected these divides, offering everything from luxury delicacies to cheap filling fare. A quirky tidbit: some cities had guilds regulating butchers, bakers, and fishmongers, enforcing standards and prices to protect consumers and maintain social order. Yet, corruption and poor enforcement sometimes undermine these efforts. Historians still argue about the extent to which urban markets improved diet quality, or simply provided more choice within existing constraints. Despite imperfections, urban food markets were vibrant centers of economic and social life, fueling the growing towns and cities of medieval Europe. So, as you imagine navigating crowded stalls filled with sights, smells, and sounds, remember that medieval urban markets offered both promise and peril, a microcosm of medieval food culture's complexity. You cautiously open a granary door, only to be greeted by the unsettling sight of gnaw marks, scattered grain, and scurrying rodents. Food storage in the medieval period was a constant battle against pests like rats and mice, whose invasions threatened both food supply and safety. Grain, the cornerstone of medieval diets, was stored in sacks, barrels, or bins, often in dark, cool places like cellars or outbuildings. But these storages were rarely rodent-proof. Rats feasted on precious grain and contaminated supplies with urine and droppings, spreading disease and ruining what little food was available. You might be surprised that communities employed various methods to deter rodents, from cats and ferrets patrolling granaries to hanging herbs and using traps. Despite these efforts, infestations were common and could devastate food reserves, especially during lean times. The loss of grain to pests was not just an inconvenience, but a serious economic and survival threat. Historians still argue about the impact of rodent infestations on medieval famines and food security. Besides, rodents, insects like weevils also infested stored grains, further degrading quality. These pests sometimes led to increased foodborne illnesses or forced consumption of lower quality food. A quirky tidbit: some medieval texts recommend burning infested grain or mixing it with fresh supplies, reflecting the limited options available to protect food stores. Food storage containers varied widely, from woven baskets to wooden barrels, none entirely effective against pests. The lack of airtight storage meant spoilage and infestation were continual concerns. Despite these challenges, medieval people developed communal and individual strategies to manage storage risks, balancing preservation with practicality. So, as you imagine the constant struggle to safeguard food from hungry rodents, remember that medieval food was not just about cooking and eating. It was about fighting for survival against tiny but relentless enemies. You raise a goblet of wine, only to find it sour, thin, and a far cry from the rich, flavorful vintages you might expect. Medieval wine was a complex and often disappointing beverage, shaped by rudimentary production methods, regional differences, and social rituals rather than refined taste. Wine was widely consumed in southern Europe, where climate favored grape cultivation. However, even in these regions, winemaking technology was primitive. Fermentation was unpredictable, and wines were often cloudy, weak, or overly acidic. Storage in wooden barrels led to oxidation and spoilage, affecting flavor and clarity. You might be surprised that most wine was diluted with water before drinking, sometimes mixed with spices, honey, or vinegar to mask off flavors and create mulled drinks. These mixtures served both to improve taste and provide warmth during cold seasons. Wine played an important social and religious role. It was central to Christian rituals and a symbol of status at feasts. Its consumption was often more about ceremony than enjoyment, with drinking patterns reflecting hierarchy and custom. A quirky tidbit: some medieval texts describe adding charcoal or egg whites to clarify wine, early attempts at improving quality that show the beginnings of enology. Historians still debate the consistency and quality of medieval wine, as well as its health effects given its acidity and contamination risks. Despite shortcomings, wine remained a valued commodity, influencing trade, agriculture, and culture. Its preparation and consumption laid foundations for modern winemaking traditions. So, as you sip your imagined cup of sour diluted wine, remember that medieval drinking was a blend of ritual survival and the ongoing quest for better flavor, a story as rich as the vineyards themselves. You sit quietly as the village healer hands you a strange concoction, claiming it will cure your ailments and balance your humors. In medieval times, food was deeply intertwined with medicine, and culinary choices were often dictated by prevailing beliefs about health rather than taste or nutrition alone. The idea that food could heal or harm was central to how people ate, leading to culinary decisions shaped by medicinal theory. The dominant medical framework was the theory of the four humors: blood phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, each associated with different qualities like hot, cold, wet, or dry. Foods were classified according to these qualities, and diets were adjusted to correct imbalances. For example, if you were thought to have too much cold in your body, you might be prescribed hot foods like spicy peppers or ginger. You might be surprised that many common ingredients such as garlic, onions, and mustard were prized for their medicinal properties. Recipes often included these not just for flavor, but to warm the body or stimulate digestion. Conversely, some foods were avoided because they were believed to exacerbate illness or imbalance. Herbs, spices, and even animal parts were commonly used both in cooking and medicine, blurring the lines between kitchen and apothecary. Some dishes were prepared primarily as remedies with flavors that might seem odd or unpleasant to modern palates. A quirky tidbit: honey was considered a universal healer and was used in syrups, ointments, and sweetened dishes for its antibacterial properties. Historians still debate the efficacy of these medicinal foods and whether their use helped or hindered medieval health outcomes. Religious and cultural beliefs also influenced medical food practices, with fasting, purging, and special diets prescribed for spiritual and physical purification. Despite the limitations of medieval medical knowledge, the integration of food and medicine shaped culinary culture, profoundly affecting what was eaten and how it was prepared. So, as you taste that herbal broth or spiced stew, remember you're experiencing a meal designed not just to satisfy hunger, but to heal and balance the very humors within. You gaze out over fields that have been battered by unpredictable weather, dry spells flooding cold snaps, all of which threaten the fragile medieval harvests. Climate was a silent but powerful force shaping what food was available when and how much. The medieval diet was inextricably linked to the whims of weather, with bad seasons bringing hunger and hardship to millions. The Little Ice Age, a period of cooler temperatures starting in the 14th century, brought shorter growing seasons and poor crop yields. This shift led to repeated famines, food shortages, and increased reliance on preserved or stored foods of questionable quality. You might be surprised how much medieval farmers struggled with pests, droughts, and floods, natural disasters that could decimate entire villages' food supplies. Crop rotation and other agricultural innovations helped but were no guarantee against nature's unpredictability. Historians still argue about the precise impact of climate change on medieval society, but it's clear that food insecurity was a chronic concern that shaped social structures and migration patterns. A quirky tidbit: some medieval texts include prayers and rituals specifically aimed at ensuring good weather and harvests, reflecting how deeply intertwined spirituality and agriculture were. Climate fluctuations also influenced dietary habits. Poor harvests meant increased reliance on less desirable foods, roots, wild plants, or preserved grains, exacerbating nutritional deficiencies and altering taste experiences. These challenges contributed to the perception of medieval food as unreliable and unappetizing, rooted in the struggle to simply survive from season to season. So, as you imagine the fields battered by storms and the anxious anticipation of harvest, remember that medieval food was not just about cooking and eating. It was a daily negotiation with the elements themselves. You find yourself in the heart of a medieval village during a festival, the air thick with the sense of roasted meats, spiced wines, and freshly baked bread. Festivals were rare and precious opportunities for food excess moments when the monotony of daily diets was broken by abundant and extravagant fare. These celebrations brought joy, community, and brief reprieves from the harsh realities of medieval eating. Feasts during religious or civic festivals featured multiple courses, including meats, sweets, and alcohol prepared with the best ingredients available. Roasted boars, pies filled with game, and spiced confections adorned tables, showcasing the host's wealth and generosity. However, these moments of plenty were fleeting. The majority of the year, people returned to simpler, more monotonous fare. Festival foods often contrasted sharply with everyday diets, emphasizing abundance and indulgence as a form of social and spiritual renewal. You might be amused to learn that some festival dishes were deliberately extravagant or bizarre, designed to impress or entertain guests rather than satisfy hunger. For example, pies with live birds inside, or sugar sculptures symbolizing political allegiances. Historians still argue how festival foods influenced broader dietary changes, or remained isolated events disconnected from daily eating habits. The seasonality of festivals also dictated food availability. Harvest festivals celebrated the bounty of crops, while winter festivals emphasized preserved foods and hearty dishes. These communal meals reinforced social bonds and hierarchies, with seating arrangements and serving order reflecting status. A quirky tidbit: festival leftovers were often distributed to the poor or used in communal meals, spreading the temporary abundance. So, as you savor the imagined feast amid music and laughter, remember that festivals were brief but vital escapes, a chance for medieval people to taste abundance in a world of scarcity. You notice the subtle shifts in medieval taste as you move from the late Middle Ages toward the early modern period, a time when food began to evolve slowly but surely, setting the stage for the culinary revolutions to come. These changes were driven by expanding trade networks, agricultural improvements, and cultural exchanges, gradually reshaping the flavors and textures that defined European cuisine. New ingredients such as tomatoes, potatoes, and chili peppers were introduced from the Americas, though their acceptance took time and varied by region. Spices became more accessible, sugar gradually less rare, and cooking techniques began to improve, allowing for lighter, more nuanced flavors. You might be surprised that early modern cooks experimented with reducing heavy sauces, emphasizing fresh herbs, and incorporating new vegetables, marking a departure from the dense spiced medieval fare. This evolution was uneven and slow, influenced by economic factors and cultural conservatism. Historians still debate how much these changes reflected genuine shifts in taste versus changing social and political contexts. For many, old habits persisted long after new ingredients arrived. A quirky tidbit: some early modern cookbooks show a mix of medieval and modern styles, blending traditional thick sauces with emerging lighter preparations. Agricultural advancements such as crop rotation and selective breeding improved yields and food quality, contributing to better diets for broader populations. These culinary shifts also mirrored broader societal changes: urbanization, exploration, and the rise of the middle class. So, as you envision the gradual transformation of medieval food into something new, remember, it was a slow, complex process that laid the foundation for the flavors and foods we enjoy today. You sit back and reflect on the entire journey through medieval food, the flavors, the struggles, the social rituals, and the enduring myths. Why was medieval food so notoriously bad? It wasn't just one reason, but a complex web of factors, from preservation challenges and limited technology to social hierarchy and religious mandates. Ingredients were often scarce or of poor quality, with preservation methods like salting and smoking altering taste and texture unfavorably. Cooking technology was rudimentary, making it difficult to control heat or develop delicate flavors. Heavy use of spices and thick sauces aimed to mask imperfections rather than enhance natural tastes. Social status dictated access to better food, creating vast disparities between peasant and noble diets. Religious fasting imposed restrictions that limited variety and often led to repetitive meals. Hygiene was poor, increasing the risk of illness and contamination. Climate and harvest variability added unpredictability, making every meal a gamble. Yet amid these challenges, people adapted creatively, developing preservation techniques, culinary rituals, and foraging strategies. Food was more than sustenance. It was a marker of identity, faith, and social order. Historians still debate many aspects of medieval cuisine, from the actual flavor profiles to the extent of foreign influence. What remains clear is that medieval food was a product of its time, a reflection of the constraints, beliefs, and innovations that shaped a world vastly different from our own. As you finish this journey, remember that the bad taste of medieval food is as much about perspective as reality. What seems unpalatable today was once normal, necessary, and in many ways, ingenious. So, as you close your eyes tonight, let the flavors of this ancient world fade gently into memory and dream of kitchens where every meal was a story of survival, tradition, and hope. Now, slow the pace, soften the words, and let your mind drift gently. The long day has ended. The smoke and spice and salted meats dissolve into the quiet night. You feel the weight of history settle softly around you, a world shaped by hunger and ingenuity, by rituals and simple joys. Let these stories fade like the last embers in the hearth, warm and comforting as your breath slows and your thoughts settle. Rest easy now. The past has fed you its tales, and tomorrow brings new flavors, new stories, new journeys. Sweet dreams. End of script. Sweet dreams.